maybe the most fruitful, the most important aspect of this interest in natural dyes is in this different vision of nature and of colors. It changes your way of looking both at our environment, looking at plants, looking at animals, and our vision of the colors which surround us, and it helps to questioning their source, how they are produced, what do they look like, what is their effect on our psychology, on our state of mind.
The story of synthetic color begins with this man, William Henry Perkin, who in 1856, at the age of 18, stumbled upon the first artificial dye. He was trying to synthesize quinine, an anti-malarial drug. The synthesis was a failure, but the results led to the first artificial color, mauve. One of the most noxious wastes of the 19th century was a thick black substance called coal tar. It was a byproduct of the production of coal gas, which was used to illuminate the streets of almost every major city at night. Coal tar posed an intense disposal problem, and so when it was discovered that distillates of this black mass would provide the raw materials for a range of synthetic colorants, there was great optimism. For industry, synthetic dyes eliminated a problematic dependence on agriculture and labor. At the time of Perkin's discovery, indigo, madder, and cochineal were of national importance to European empires. A color's availability was dependent on trade routes and was subject to colonial power struggles, the fortunes of war, and political intrigue. The market for colorants was also heavily tied to the use of slave and indentured labor. Colonial India had troubles in Bengal and Bihar when peasants were forced to grow indigo rather than food crops, a situation which led to widespread famine and the Blue Mutiny of 1859. Over the years, the ease of use and quality of synthetic colorants has improved to the point where they have saturated the contemporary world with choice. It is expected that any object may be any color. But, like other developments that characterize the modern world, the liberating gift of chromatic abundance has its price. Today, an individual's relationship to color is abstract, mediated through powerful high-resolution computer monitors, through books of print samples and paint chits. The possibilities are so great today that many organizations provide professional color guidance. Specific hues are selected, combined, and recommended by branded designers. These increasingly harken back to a time when color was more deeply tied to a material substance, place, or culture. Such names as Turkish red, Armenian red, indigo, rose madder, imperial purple, vermilion, scarlet, all indicate much more than a shade. They are doors into a world of lost color. In the Ballard district of Seattle, Michelle Whipplinger runs Earth Hues, a natural color company. Michelle has many years of experience researching and teaching about color, textiles, and dyes. With inexpensive, high-quality synthetic color so readily available, why use natural dyes?
Why not? I mean, I say that honestly. Is there to be only one dye that we can use? But people always ask me that question. It's, for me, an easy decision, because when you study natural dyes, you study culture, and it's very interesting. When you look at natural dyes and you use it, you develop relationships with people all over the world. You need to learn more about it, and so you study with master dyers who tell you secrets and help you understand about what you do. So it's about anthropology. It's about knowing the world. It's aromatic. I love that about it. It's aromatic when you dye with it, and your yarn or your cloth has a wonderful smell. It's not a toxic thing because you're using only alum, at least that's what I do. I don't have to worry about disposal of it. I can use it with children. I can handily do educational programs. And the level at which I've developed it, it's as good as a synthetic dye. I can get any color that I want. So the growing of dyes is a great story. The using of the dyes is a great story from a historical, cultural standpoint. It's complex. It's a life study. You'll never know everything you want to know about it. So it's a journey to take.
The art of dyeing begins here, with the fiber. Natural fibers are of two main kinds, cellulose-based and protein-based. Cellulose fibers come from plants such as cotton, linen, and hemp. Protein fibers come from animals. These are fibers such as hairs, silks, and wools. The two types of fibers behave differently, and no dye will behave exactly the same on both cellulose and protein fibers. Whatever is going to be dyed must be washed. This is true for both loose yarns and woven cloth. Washing does what we always expect of washing, removes grease, dust, sizing, natural oils, and whatever chemicals might be left over from the manufacturing process. Any foreign matter will act as a resist and prevent even dye coverage.
Your dyeing is only as good as your water. That's the first step. You have to assess the hardness or softness of a water. Is it acidic? Is it a sweet water? For instance, in Seattle, where I live, it's glacier water that we use, and the pH of our water can be between 5 and 6 on any given day, with 7 being neutral. Places like Central Asia, parts of Turkey, the water is very hard. It has calcium and magnesium salts. And those are very difficult for certain dyes, especially in the red families. So it's very interesting in the parts of the world that use madder, they had hard water. So that was their primary red. And in the parts of the world that use lac, a small insect dye throughout Southeast Asia, their water is very soft. So it's typical that the water in a region where a dye was developed, a red dye, they had the right water for the dye.
The traditional Ajrak block printing community of Damadka, located in India's Kutch Desert, depends on water for dyeing.
Former time we are doing natural dyeing. At that time, that facility and now's facility that different. Like collecting to the raw material and collecting to water system. You know, former time we have the rain, we have the river, and we are washing, and that no we have need to electricity, no need borewell, no need drainage. And if we think we go to wash, then we go there and washing and do that. But the river dried last 20 years, and then we have problem something, so we are doing we buying some land and make a well and making tank for the washing facility. Whenever we go to deep borewell making, then available water that not very good, there are lot of iron inside.
When the area was hit by a large earthquake in 2001, the water table shifted and the composition of the water changed. Because the water changed, dye recipes also had to be adjusted. Over the past 10 years, the well has needed to be drilled twice as deep in order to draw water. The dyers estimate that they may only have another 10 years before the water is too salty to be usable. The wastewater from natural dye operations may be used as is to irrigate crops. This is true of the water from procedures such as indigo extraction and the actual dyeing. The spent plant matter becomes a useful compost. In comparison, synthetic dyes require a large amount of water and large amounts of salt. In places like India, there are seldom treatment facilities, and so the effluent is also a pollutant.
My name is Mahesh. My village is Bagru. Bagru is famous block printing and natural dye, all world. This business is 6th generation in my family in Bagru. My family is block printing involved, and many people is involved is natural dyeing and some chemical printing. Sometimes it's chemical dyeing requirement is customer. Sometimes chemical dyeing and natural dyeing. When the chemical printing is very bad, water problem. Natural dye is everybody is no problem, water, pupil, everything, and chemical is Neptol and Ramazol and Rapid. This time using the main problem is water. Now it is Sangalet. Sangalet is well making 200 feet is gone, so color chemical is water is coming. Also pen problem, teeth is yellow. This type big problem. Now is Sangalet chemical dye. Everybody is chemical dye using. Now is very big problem. And Bagru is only 6-7 families natural dyeing is doing.
The way that the red is fixed onto the cloth, of course, would be with an alum mordant. That's really what made India so superior, that they really cracked the technology as long ago as in Mohenjo-daro. 2,000 years ago they were mordant dyeing red dyes. And it's really the red that did it for India.
The study of mordants forms a vital part of dye knowledge. The possible combinations of fiber types, mordants, and dyes can easily reach a state of great complexity. In the past, the complex dye recipes and procedures became family and guild secrets. The penalties for betraying these secrets could be high indeed. Amy Butler Greenfield, in her book A Perfect Red, describes the medieval guilds and notes that the cost for compromising the guild's reputation through the substitution of cheap ingredients could be a very expensive fine or the dyer's right hand. In the year 1900, Muzaffar el-Din became the Shah of Persia. One of his first edicts was to outlaw the use of synthetic aniline dyes, which he felt were ruining the Persian carpet industry. all aniline dyes were seized and publicly burned. In the contemporary tourist trade, claims of natural dye use are greatly exaggerated. The public wants vegetable colors, but generally doesn't know much about them. Few buyers can tell that reds don't come from poppies, greens don't come from mint leaves, and the electric shade of a blue scarf, claimed to be natural, was never produced by any form of indigo. The problem is not just one of false advertising to increase the price. It is rather that as the use of synthetic colorants replaces traditional dye use, the recipes developed over hundreds of years are lost. For competitive reasons, these recipes were rarely written down, instead being transferred through a system of apprenticeship and study. One of the most complicated aspects of dyeing is the mordanting process. While many dyes will give a strong color, the addition of a mordant increases the depth of color, its light fastness, and resistance to rubbing off.
Well, all dyes need a fixative, and I want to start by saying that even synthetic dyes need them, but they're bound up in the chemical structure of the dye. So with the use of natural dyes, it's a separate process. So some of the very traditional mordants that have been used through history are alum. It's this white rock if you look at it crudely. If you get it very refined, it's potassium aluminum sulfate. And that gives the clearest, brightest, the purest colors, and has been used historically all over the world.
Alum is a prized mordant because it gives a bright color and does not tinge the cloth with its own color. As such, it was in great demand in medieval Europe. The fight for control of the alum supply involved the Turks, who controlled most of the productive sites. As their empire expanded, the price quintupled. At the height of demand, new mines were discovered in the Papal States of Italy. Capitalizing on short supply, the papacy made a quick profit and used the newfound wealth to launch a crusade against the Turks.
Iron is another. Ferrous sulfate is another mordant that's used to do what we call sadden a color, to make it dull. But it makes some very interesting colors. When combined, say, with yellow, it gives you greens. So therefore, you don't have to use another dye to get a green. Then there's other mordants, like chrome, potassium dichromate. And that was used in Europe, especially during the birthing of the chemical industry. However, it's really very highly toxic. And it's not a mordant that's recommended at this stage either for indigenous people, who actually never really did use it, and for modern dyers who are trying to do projects. So potassium dichromate does give interesting colors, but it's not worth the pollution both to the water system and to the user.
For cellulose fibers such as cotton, metal mordants are often ineffective on their own. For such fibers, tannin works as an additional mordant, which is usually applied before the metal mordant. The use of cow or camel dung is part of traditional block print production, and in this case the dung behaves as both a cleaner and a tannic agent.
And these are walnuts. And both these acorn shells and these walnuts contain very high amount of tannin.
Tannin is readily available from a number of sources, including oak galls, and throughout the tropics from myrobalan nuts, which are used in powdered form. Plant fibers do not combine with mordants as easily as animal fibers do. Jim Lyles, in his book The Art and Craft of Natural Dyeing, points out that the ancients sought to remedy this difference by animalizing the plant fibers. Hence, plant fibers were pre-treated with the liquid insides of slaughtered animals, with dung solutions, with milk, and with nut gall extracts, thought to be animal products. The procedure worked. The animal products contain albumin, fats, and gelatinous substances, which are attracted and held by cotton, and all combined with metal mordants. Today, such messy procedures are seldom used, all the necessary tannin being provided by plants. Throughout India, myrobalan is a preferred source of tannin. It may be used cold, making it an efficient and effective mordant for a variety of textiles. Myrobalan nuts contain tannin, gallic acid, ellagic acid, and yellow dyestuffs. The distinctive light yellow of the cloth makes the addition of this step in the dye process easily recognized. The production of a clear, brilliant red that does not bleed when applied to cloth, that does not fade in the light, that does not become weak when the cloth is washed, is the ultimate test of the dyer's art. It is the color of life, of desire, anger, rage, and passion. For centuries, the most prized source for red was the root of the madder plant.
The madder root, dried and ground into dyer's powder, was carried by Phoenician traders and mentioned in Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Greek historian wanderer Herodotus noted that it produced the striking vermilion shades on the goatskin cloaks of Libya's most elegant women. The Bible refers to madder as puah, which some scholars believe was also a lullaby sound used to calm crying infants. To the Romans, it was rubia, which has endured as its scientific name. Alchemists pored over its properties in hopes of coaxing magic from nature. Artists made their canvases glow with madder-based glazes. As the Dutch master Jan Vermeer was finishing his famous Girl with a Red Hat in 1666, colonies were taking root across the Atlantic that would rebel a century later against the British Crown. The soldiers of King George III, sent to fight the American patriots, wore madder-dyed red coats.
The finger-sized roots are harvested, dried, and then ground into a powder. Here, a mechanical grinder is used to process relatively large quantities of the root for the dough bag project. The dough bag project was founded by Dr. Harold Bomer and is committed to the production and marketing of naturally dyed carpets featuring traditional designs.
And this dye bath for madder is heated up to 60 degrees.
Madder will give a variety of shades depending on many factors. High temperature will move the final shade away from the reds and into a deep mahogany brown. The pH of the vat will shift the color either toward an orange or a blood red. One of the fascinating aspects of natural dyeing traditions is that such techniques are clearly known. A dyer's technique is a local solution to the demands of color. All over the world, dyers understand the implications of altering the pH of a vat, without necessarily understanding the theory of modern chemistry. If such specific knowledge is remarkable today, it also leads those who work with natural color to consider what may have been lost in the century and a half since the birth of synthetic dyes. The strength and weakness of synthetic dyes is that they produce one exact shade or hue. This gives a designer immense control over the palette. But in the opinion of many, control comes at the expense of depth and richness. A complex color, especially on cloth, will be a combination of shades. This dynamic provides interest as the shades change and interact in different lights, and over time, the life and personality of the cloth will develop its own voice.
The very best, fastest, and most sought-after red on cotton and linen from about 1600 to 1930 was Turkey red. The process was much more complicated than that for simple madder red. It originally involved some 13 to 20 tricky steps to be executed over a 3 to 4 month period. Ingredients used in various of the steps included cattle, sheep, or camel dung, rancid olive oil, castor oil, sesame seed oil, palm oil, fish oil or lard, soda ash, tannin, alum, chalk, madder, and sometimes blood. The brightening process, which produces the brilliant fiery shades, included boiling the dyed articles, sometimes for several hours under pressure with soap solutions, and sometimes with tin salts. Even the best dye houses, usually set up for turkey red dyeing alone, had reasonably frequent failures. Turkey red was expensive, but if well done it would last until the yarn or cloth was in tatters, and it did not fade or bleed out on surrounding white areas.
The ability to make turkey red was a complicated but potent skill, but the knowledge of how to get madder to yield purple seemed the stuff of dyer's legend. The mysterious process was rediscovered by American adventuress Josephine Powell and German chemist Dr. Harold Boehmer.
When I started, there were 40,000 villages in this country, to say nothing of other groups. But I've documented as much as I could. And Dr. Boehmer has done his flowers, and he's done his nomads, and his knowledge of plants and so on.
Some of the purples found in Turkish and Persian carpets were a mystery. It is now known, and confirmed through chemical analysis, that the purple comes from madder, cold dyed, with a very particular mordant process. There are several species of this famous dye plant. The two most used are Rubia tinctoria, grown in Turkey and a number of countries in the Middle East, and Rubia cordifolia, grown mostly in India. Morinda is cultivated extensively throughout Southeast Asia. The two species most used for dyeing are Morinda citrifolia and Morinda tinctoria. It is also known by the common name Indian mulberry and all. The bark and the roots provide a range of colors from yellows to reds. Morinda is a small tree which may be harvested after 4 years. The best dye comes from roots and root bark of less than 1 centimeter in diameter. In India, dyeing with aal is done by immersing yarns in a solution of aal and then adding the powdered aal roots directly to the yarns and kneading the yarns. The process involves many stages often found in traditional dyeing: pre-treatment with dung, ash water, and the addition of oils. The dye procedure eliminates the colorants which would give yellows and encourages a well-established shade of red. In the state of Orissa, this limited palette leads to very distinctive textiles. Artisans work with white cotton, golden tussar silk, and the awl dye. When mordanted with alum, a deep brownish red results. When iron is added, the color shifts to purple. The red shades found on the famous story cloths of Sumba are obtained from Marinda. The tree will endure a light harvest of its roots every few months. A dyer may have a tree in the yard which is visited on a regular basis. The roots are pulverized and soaked in water. Using the ECAT method, the yarns have been tied to resist the dye. Leaves are added to control the pH, and the bath is left to soak. When the dyer next visits the vat, the color is an earthy brick red. Cochineal is the ultimate insect dye. The deep, fast color that it produces is believed to have been developed by selective breeding of the insect in pre-Columbian America. Compared to madder, cochineal is very potent. The deep shade produced with cochineal would require 40 times as much dye stuff if madder was used. The color comes from a particular species of cochineal insect, an aphid-like creature which colonizes the nopal cactus. As a defense mechanism, cochineal produces carminic acid to protect itself against ants and other predators. Carminic acid is a powerful red dye that may be obtained simply by collecting and drying the cochineal insects. When applied to mordanted cloth, the color will last as long as the fabric. Cochineal is used as a red dye in a number of foods and cosmetics. In 1976, the United States found red dye number 2 carcinogenic and banned its use. Cochineal is viewed as a natural replacement, although some people become squeamish when they discover that a food colorant comes from a bug. For centuries, the Spanish had such complete control over this exotic dye stuff that Europeans could not determine if the color came from an insect or a plant. The cochineal reds were visibly different from madder reds. The intensity of these unique shades made the cochineal market very lucrative. Today, with so many colors readily available, it is difficult to imagine the wealth that could be obtained by controlling a color. The Spanish Empire understood this power, and the secrets of cochineal were held against other Europeans for hundreds of years. Nor was the value of color lost on pre-Columbian societies, who used cochineal as a form of currency and exacted it as tribute. The preparation of cochineal cakes makes a convenient form for trade and exchange.
I'm quite interested in lac dyeing in general, and about in the mid-90s I went to Assam just to sort of see in general what they did there in terms of silk weaving and dyeing. And I was taken to a village just within Assam on the way to Meghalaya where they were doing lac dyeing in a very sort of casual way. They would just go into the forest and break off a branch that had the secretions of the insect on it, bring it back to the village, stick it in a mortar, pound it with a bit of water and some other leaves that they'd just collected, stick in a bit of eri silk which they had woven, and it would come out a rather beautiful sort of raspberry colour. A very nice sort of pinkish, mauvish colour, but not very intense. And I think that's a rather, characteristic of the lac dyeing in a lot of those places, that it's not done with the aim of a very intense colour. They just want to put it in the dye and get a beautiful shade. So it's not very strong. But when I went back to Assam this year to see if I could find any lac dyeing, everyone told me that it had stopped. I don't think anyone is, as far as I could tell, no one in Assam was doing it at the village level anymore, which is rather sad.
The colorant from the lac insect works very well on protein fibers. Its ability to dye silk has made it a popular dye in India and Southeast Asia. It is highly favored in Laos, where silk production and weaving traditions remain active. The lac insect's secretions contain two main components, the colorant and the resin. If the crushed lac is washed with cold water, the dye will dissolve and the resin may be filtered out. If the resin is refined, it is known as shellac, a popular finish for furniture and stringed instruments. Shellac was also used to produce 78 RPM records before the introduction of vinyl. The name lac comes from the Sanskrit word for 100,000. It is an appropriate name for the thousands of insects which colonize branches. The pH of the lac dye bath is very important. In Laos, the pH is controlled through the addition of acidic leaves, sour tamarind, or even the nests of ants. Here in Orissa, a small test batch of yarn is dyed with lac. The dyer will use the test batch as an indication of how to proceed with larger vats. Like most agricultural products, natural dyes show a great deal of variation. They will change depending on the temperature of the seasons, the amount of rainfall, the type of soil where they are grown or collected, and the time of the harvest. These variations are natural in natural products. It is only recently, with the introduction of factory farms, additives, and artificial colors, that Western society has come to expect exact uniformity in all of its produce. For the dyer, the necessary test batch will give a clear indication of how the dye will behave, so that recipes may be adjusted. It is the skill of a master dyer to be able to orchestrate all the elements of dyeing, from mordants to fibers to the pH of the dye bath, to achieve beautiful and exact hues from such diverse materials.
Well, I have a personal relationship with insect dyes, you know, from when I started trying to find Kermes insects again, nobody remembered what they were, what they looked like. We knew vaguely where to look for, but the first day I personally met a Kermes insect was really a great emotion, and the color is so beautiful. It's that's why it appealed to ancient civilization so much. It's really the color of blood, the color of life. It's a kind of symbolism which is universal. And when you see that this small insect actually gives such a bright, shiny red, it's really a great emotion. Yes, it's a Kermes insect, a female, an adult female which is full of eggs, and the larvae may come out any time. It's just the right time of the year. And in that case you will see a crowd of tiny red dots running around the branches. It's rather funny.
This parasitic insect is hosted by the Kermes oak and is found in the hot, dry regions of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The adult females are pea-sized and have neither legs nor eyes. Filled with the eggs of their unborn young, the insects are harvested just before the larvae emerge, killed with either vinegar or steam, and then dried. The raw dye material consists of the bodies of the dried insects. The terms crimson and vermilion are both names for shades of Kermes red. Both terms were originally based on the misconception that the insect was a worm. Kermes was also believed to be a grain or dried berry, and hence the term grana was applied to it and other insect dyes. The term ingrained refers to one of the best properties of the insect dyes, their fastness. Kermes was a popular dye as far back as the 3rd century BC and was known to Roman, Greek, and Phoenician cultures. In the 13th century, the robes of Roman Catholic cardinals changed from purple to Kermes red when the Ottomans reached into the Byzantine Empire and the decline of shellfish purple began. With the introduction of cochineal after the Spanish conquest, the use of Kermes also went into decline. Today, Kermes is commercially unavailable and is only used by a handful of enthusiasts. Polish Kermes is similar to oak Kermes, but where oak Kermes grows out in the open, this variety attaches itself to the roots of the scleranth plant, making collection extremely difficult. The insect was traditionally harvested on the feast day of St. John, so it is also known as St. John's blood. Like cochineal, it served as payment for tithes and rents in the areas where it could be found. The red was brilliant, and many valued it above oak Kermes. The traveller Frédéric Perrault writes in his 1834 book, Trip to Ararat, that the sheep that grazed in the salt marshes on the slopes of Ararat had red feet.
The story about the sheep with red feet fascinated us. In 1986, we made the journey to Mount Ararat, but collected the wrong insects. In 1990, following the advice of Dominique Cardon, we found the right bugs. Before sunrise, they were crawling around on the surface of the ground, and let themselves be easily gathered. An hour later, the red animals had all disappeared underground again. The method of killing used for the Mediterranean kermes, a mild vinegar solution, had no effect on the Ararat kermes. Even after a bath in a 50% solution, the bugs were soon crawling happily around the car during the 2,000-kilometer journey back to Istanbul. Finally, we put the bugs in the laboratory oven. This brutal treatment produced a pleasant odor of fresh roast throughout the lab and down the hall, since the Ararat kermes consists of up to 50% of fatty lipids. These fatty substances also make dying with the insect more difficult.
Over the years, reds have always been popular. Amy Butler Greenfield, in her book A Perfect Red, mentions that a cloth dyed a deep shade of scarlet could cost up to 10 times as much as a cloth dyed sky blue. Before the modern era, a color's desirability was usually directly related to its scarcity. Prestige has always been linked to rare items, and so before the introduction of cochineal, the ability to produce a scarlet red which leaned towards purple would be richly rewarded. With skill, this color could be obtained from hardwoods of the genus Casalpinia. Commonly known as Brazilwood, the dyes worked best on silk, but were somewhat fugitive, often softening to a lighter pinky brown with repeated exposure to bright sunlight. When new varieties of this hardwood were found in South America, the area was christened Brazil after this valuable plant. This hardwood has been heavily exploited to the point of near extinction in the wild. Overharvesting is not a recent problem. The first conservation laws prohibiting the felling of young trees were implemented by Philip II in 1605. The wood is still prized for violin bows, and dyers may make good use of the scraps and sawdust from this industry. Sapanwood dyes a somewhat lighter color than Brazilwood, but the same tinctorial principle, Brazilin, appears to be common to all. Although still a tropical hardwood, Sapanwood is not at present an endangered species.
The thing about indigo, it's so universal. So you get all this daily cloth, jeans, denim, work clothes, all that kind of stuff, brilliant for working in. But you've got this other layer, which is all these prestigious textiles. So if your cloth is dyed 50 times and then embroidered, then it becomes a prestige piece. So indigo crosses every side of the social spectrum. Some of my favourite pieces come from South Arabia. They're also not very well known. The dress on the left is from Yemen, where they have this burnished indigo. The indigo cloth is beaten and sometimes polished with stones as well, as is the turban on the right-hand side. And it makes a wonderful foil for this extraordinary embroidery and brass paillettes and appliqué work, and mother of pearl and so on. You can see the shiny man's turban down below to the right. Wilfrid Thesiger would take these turbans as presents when he wanted to give presents to the tribesmen when he crossed Saudi Arabia. And similarly, the face mask, very prestigious. The women wore these masks. That one I think is from Oman. And the shiny indigo, which had been beaten into it, then made it come off onto the skin, and that was good for the skin as well. So if you had a blue face, that was a good thing, not a bad thing. Good for the skin and showed you had lots of money, you could afford a burnished mask. On the right, you have the most extraordinarily beautiful and exquisite Chinese skirt. It's from Guizhou province in southwest China. And because they didn't necessarily want the indigo to rub off, in China they would beat it as well with stones, but they would also add egg white and persimmon juice and ox blood to fix the cloth and make it shiny. Yes, there's quite a debate about whether natural indigo is really better than synthetic indigo. The thing is that synthetic indigo, chemically speaking, works the same as natural indigo because they synthesized it. So it's not a substitute, it behaves in the same way. So denim jeans still have that wonderful rub-off look that you get with natural indigo in old textiles. The point is that natural indigo comes from the plant. Synthetic indigo comes from the petrochemical industry. So it's a rather nasty product, and it's a nasty byproduct. So in itself, synthetic indigo is not something one would want to encourage, in a sense. But if you're going to dye all the genes in the world with indigo, it's not viable to have, you'd have to take up too much land. So you couldn't viably make natural indigo for all the genes industry. Although in the case of Europe, they're actually trying to replace all the indigo in the textile industry in Europe with indigo from woad. And also in Europe, you've got the land, because we've got all this spare land. So this is a really good project. You're getting farmers to grow woad on land that would be just set aside and nothing happening.
Personally, I have a tendency to prefer woad. Once you're into this specific type of blue, which is very different than, of course, the colors you see in indigo or the different shades of blues you see in indigo, woad catches on to you very quickly. So it has a lot more of a rich intensity to it, which makes it what we call in French an ennoblissement, meaning it renders noble your fabric. There's not an English term that corresponds to this definition, and it's not a simple dye. Contrary to what you would call madder root or weld or even indigo being a dye, woad is an ennoblissement. In France, they made that difference because it's true that it renders your fabric more noble, more beautiful, more intense, more unique. When we were interested, and my husband became interested in woad, we did not want to bring it out and put it only on fabric. We wanted to prove to modern industry that are getting into more and more friendly environmental processes that plant dyes can also be used in other diversities of industries ranging from car paint to airplane paint to biodegradable plastic to cosmetics to decorative paints to art products to paper to printing inks. The farming is easy. It's a very simple plant. We've developed a technique of harvesting and treating the leaves immediately on a larger scale. We have a machine that can harvest 42 tons of leaves per day. We have built an extraction unit. The whole difficulty is in extracting the color from the leaves on a larger scale. We require 1 ton of fresh leaves for only 2 kilos of powdered blue. Keep in mind that the harvesting of the leaves is only the first year, and either we eliminate those leaves or we let part of the plant go up into the flowering and the seeds for the oil and for the future crops. So we had to find a solution to work on a larger scale and to extract this pigment on a larger scale. We just started off like that. We will establish or try to figure out what we can do with it. And we advance very quickly by collaborating. If we had tried to do it all by ourselves, we would still be on a very smaller scale. If we had tried to put it only on the textile, then we would still be on a smaller scale.
In Roman times, a shellfish purple dye works was set up on this island, just off the coast of Morocco, by Juba II. And Juba's son, Ptolemy, was murdered by the Roman Emperor Caligula, supposedly for wearing a magnificent purple robe. Ptolemy wasn't the only one to lose his life for purple. The Mediterranean harvesting process involved quickly killing the mollusk and removing the dye glands, a procedure which resulted in huge middens of discarded murex shells. Up to 60,000 snails were needed to produce a single pound of purple dye, making shellfish purple one of the most expensive substances of the ancient world. A pound of silk dyed purple would be worth the equivalent of $35,000 today. Legend attributes the discovery of purple to the Phoenician god Melkarth, whose dog bit into a seashell that turned his mouth a rich purple. There is evidence that by about 1000 BC, the murex snail was being used to dye cloth. The Phoenicians were experts in the use of the dye stuff, but the increasing scarcity of the snails drove the prices even higher. In Roman times, use of the color was restricted to senators and the emperor. For this reason, the color is often known as imperial purple. Overharvesting, the vast number of snails needed, and the fall of the Byzantine Empire led to the decline of this exotic dye stuff.
Yo con uno que no conozco, Huatuco ni el tubo.
The inhabitants of the Pacific regions of Central America had discovered that the dye of the snails found in their coastal waters could be milked with no need to open the shell or kill the organism. The action of the wind and sun alone were enough to fix the dye. Caracol purpura is the only dye in the world to possess such properties. This remarkable dye, obtained from an equally remarkable creature, may not survive much longer. Traditional harvesting recognized the need for care when milking the snails, and thus restricted harvest to the months between October and March, and to mature snails over a certain size. They were not permitted to return to anyone's site until a full lunar month had passed. Caracol specialist Marta Turok reports that in the 1970s, the snail population fell dramatically due to the overexploitation by a Japanese company, Imperial Purple. The company was harvesting the dye for silk kimonos and luxury furnishings. The purpura snail is a good example of a natural dye which cannot be used on a production basis. Any use beyond a small group will exhaust the resource. In 1988, an accord was signed to restrict the use of purpura to traditional ethnic groups. In addition, the harvest areas for the snail have been added to UNESCO's network of biosphere reserves.
I don't use dye as chamomile so much. I prefer dye as so wort. Here I find it grows about 2 meters high. It's a perennial plant, so once you have established it and it grows, it's a fabulous source of dyeing matter, actually. The side of the margin of the leaf looks like a saw. You see, it's serrated, very serrated margin. And it's even more so in the variety from Mount Igual, which is slightly smaller but extremely concentrated in dyeing matter. And it's also an interesting plant because, like Dyer's Weld, it's more full of flavones, which are the fastest group of flavonoid dyes, whereas like Dyer's Chamomile, you have a majority of flavonols which tend to be less fast to light than flavones. So Wert and Weld are really the best dye plants from the point of view of fastness.
A large number of dye plants are available for yellows, but few provide tints that will not fade. A select few will give deep egg yolk tones or bright shades with lemon-like intensity, and some are especially useful to provide base colors for overdying. The use of weld extends back to Neolithic times, and it was in commercial use until the invention of chemical colorants. The plant flourishes in North America, Europe, North Africa, and as far east as the Anatolian Plateau in Turkey. It is for yellows what madder is for reds, an easily cultivated plant that gives a clear, fast yellow, which may be used on almost any fiber.
So it can take another dyeing gradient, and that will be the yellow not from chamomile. We found out it doesn't work quite. This is a dry weld plant.
For the Dobag project in Turkey, weld is frequently added in coarse form. The entire dye plant contains the colorant. Here yarns dyed with indigo are immersed in weld. The result will be a clear emerald green. Despite its ease of use and many good qualities, the dyers of Europe slowly shifted their preference to imported hardwoods from the New World. Old Fustic, known also as Dyer's Mulberry, produces a strong yellow. It was brought back to Europe by Spanish explorers and subsequently harvested to the point where conservation is now necessary. It is commonly shipped as an extract. In about 1775, Dr. Edward Bancroft, a double agent in the pay of both American revolutionaries and the British government, discovered a yellow dye in the inner bark of the American black oak tree. Bancroft claimed the dye was 4 times as strong as Old Fustic and up to 10 times more powerful than weld. He secured letters from Parliament giving him exclusive import rights, and in a stroke of branding genius renamed the dye stuff Quercitron, claiming the role of an inventor rather than a naturalist. For over 100 years it was the strongest yellow known to the world, and its commercial use continued until about 1920. Osage orange is a thorny hardwood that gained notoriety as one of the few woods strong enough to create the required tension of a crossbow. In the southern United States, its extreme hardness and rot resistance made it ideal for fence posts and wagon wheels. The sawdust provides an excellent colorant, and it was heavily used in the US when European dye supplies were interrupted by the First World War. The wood of the jackfruit tree contains the same colorant as Old Fustic. The tree is also commercially important for its fruit, which can reach up to 85 pounds. Cultivation yields a large amount of wood from pruning and replanting. The most famous use of this particular dye stuff was to color the traditional robes of Buddhist monks from Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Dominique Cardon points out that the original colors of these garments would have been a quiet yellowy orange. The bright shades now typically associated with chemical dyes are discouraged by orthodoxy, which recommends a detachment from the pleasures of earthly life, including delight in color. After years of neglect, jackfruit is regaining importance as a dye plant in Laos and Thailand. One of the most pleasant dyestuffs to bring to a boil in the dye vat is chamomile. A tea of this flower will give a pleasing, gentle yellow. It is common in Morocco, and Turkey counts up to 50 varieties that grow wild. When madder is added, it will move from yellow into a warm orange. Most yellow dyes can have improved light fastness by dyeing in a copper pot or by adding a few clean pennies or a pinch of copper sulfite to the dye bath. It is a paradox of dyeing that the color of the dyestuff is seldom the color obtained on cloth. This is not true of marigold, for which the dyer may see the bright shades of the flowers transferred to yarns. When marigold is overdyed with indigo, it gives a delicate shade reminiscent of young moss. The rinds of the pomegranate fruit provide tannin, and it is almost always used in combination with other dyestuffs. It will increase the light fastness of turmeric, and when combined with iron, it will provide a satisfying black. The rinds are readily available throughout Asia as the waste part of the fruit. Most natural shades of brown are derived from dye plants with a high tannin content. This makes them very light fast on cotton and provides a range of deep shades from tan to olive. Kutch has been used in India for thousands of years, and for centuries it could be found in the calicos shipped from India to Europe. The dyestuff comes from boiling the chipped heartwood of the Kutch plant, or Acacia catechu, in water. The tree is also a host to the lac insect. Long used as a colorant for body decoration, the dried leaves of the henna plant will yield a delicate brown. In Morocco, distinctive patterns are still produced, and the production of these cloths by tribal cultures is one of the few traditions to survive the advent of chemical dyes. It is fortunate for dyers that the plants which give the darkest shades are also the fastest. Walnut is perhaps the best example, containing a variety of intense, dark colorants for which no mordant is needed. Tea is also a rich source of tannin, and, as any tea drinker knows, the dried leaves, once boiled, will provide a brown shade. Much of the Munnar Hills in Kerala, South India, are tea plantations, and the tea waste from this processing is used as a source of tannin for the Aranya Natural Dye Project.
And I originally met Victoria through Pitchy Reddy. Pitchy Reddy supplies indigo to this project, and thankfully he introduced me to Victoria. Victoria, how long have you been involved in?
Past 10 years I'm working with this shade. Aranya started in 1994, and there's two aims for Aranya. One is to revitalize the ancient art of natural dyeing, and number two is to rehabilitate our physically challenged young adults.
This is a resist and mordant dyed piece from the Mughal period, late 17th century, probably about 1680s, and it's in a very classic design. But this one is particularly nice because you can see the resist patterns that have been done with a very fine pen against the black ground. Now the black ground was made mostly with an iron mordant, which is the traditional way of getting a black colour, but unfortunately, as often happens with iron, it eats through the ground, and you can see in this case that quite a few of these black areas, I mean some have gone entirely, quite a few of these black areas have started to be eaten away by the dye itself.
Here we have a line of 100% linen men's shirts. The palette is a very subtle palette. We've achieved that palette with the use of irons and other dyes. Here you have some light gray colors achieved with very small amount of iron over myrobalan. It's not good to use too much iron. We've used iron in combination with pomegranate skins, which is a very nice combination. They bond very well with each other. You can get almost to a jet black with pomegranate skins with just a bit of iron over myrobalan. Here we have iron over indigo to give quite a deep indigo, iron over madder root, and iron over kutch.
It is said that one day a hunter went in the bush. He went hunting, so he shot a game. The game ran and fell in a river. So the hunter went into the river to get the game. And when he was in the river, his tunic was stained by clay. When he came back home, so his wife realized that his tunic was stained. So she tried to wash it. The clay disappeared, but in its place, there was a black dot. And the following morning, she purposefully stained her loincloth with clay, wash it, and she got the same result. That's how this technique was discovered.
Here, ferrous sulfate is added to a mixture of water and powdered myrobalan. The resulting black dye shows clearly the reaction of tannins with iron. The term bogalan refers to an African cloth decorated with black mud.
So when you boil the leaves, and you have this...
The cloth is pre-treated with a tannic agent, usually from the leaves or the bark of a local tree. By applying a mud which is rich in iron, the design is made to appear. The iron in the mud reacts with the tannin already on the cloth to produce a strong black. A dye originally found in South America, logwood was used by the Aztecs for ink and to dye food. Logwood was important in Europe as a replacement for iron, as one of the few plants that will give a grey and the only significant plant to give a violet. In 2007, commercial supplies of logwood for dyers vanished. The market was cornered by a group that now has over 40 tons of the stuff and is using its stores to supply the medical industry. In diagnostic tests, logwood stains the nucleus of the cell. Here, the dark blue indicates the nuclei of cells in the lung of an emphysema patient. It stains so clearly that scientists can tell the age and the cycle of the cell. While an artisan dyer may be willing to pay $15 for 100 grams of logwood, the same amount sold to the medical industry will net $600. These two varieties of Casalpinia grow in South and Central America. Both have tannin-rich pods, which may be used to dye a black color with the addition of iron. There is evidence of pre-Columbian use, and coastal peoples would immerse their cloths in a special iron-rich mud found in boggy areas in order to achieve a dark black. The pods were exported to Europe, where they found a ready market in leather tanning and the production of black ink. The environmental friendliness of natural dyes has caught the eye of many forward-thinking industrialists. The colorants found in nature may be extracted from their organic hosts and concentrated into an extract. They may be used directly for dyeing or formed into an insoluble pigment for a wide range of applications. Those who manufacture extracts must be aware of the ecology upon which their business depends. There is a potential to exploit plant resources at the expense of local populations and indigenous craftspeople. Industry also requires a level of standardization and uniformity which is untenable on an artisan level. Certification programs, while attractive to the consumer and generally a positive educational step, are of doubtful value to the small artisan who can seldom afford certification or is too isolated to participate in such a program. Couleur de Plant partners with agronomists to select varieties of dye plants that will grow well in cultivation, with little or no fertilizers, and yield the maximum amount of pigment.
At the beginning we started from about 700 species. Then we started to grow them. On the experimental field we have about 40 species, different species. And then for our culture we have selected 10 different cultivars of all these species. So we started from 700 species and now we have 10 species. So what we make when we prepare some extraction, this is that we take some samples of all the different years of harvesting.
Then you will concentrate the extract and you obtain a sort of syrup. For the extract, you just take the syrup and you dry it. It's very concentrated and it is
soluble
in water.
Water soluble.
Yes. So you can use it for textile, dye, for all kind of dyeing, textile, hair, whatever you want. The other one is pigment. It's a bit more difficult. You take the syrup and then you put in.
Just add some aluminium salt. You make it insoluble. So the pigment does precipitate in the tank and you have just to separate it. Well, there's a problem on cotton to get some very nice threads. You can get it by hand when you mold it and when you make several dye baths, but you can afford several baths in industrial productions.
And we can't have a red on cotton. So if you have an idea.
We'd get a red with Indian madder, but it's a long process, and all of thy hands.
With several dye baths.
And do they use the roots or an extract?
Roots.
The roots.
No, roots.
Directly the roots.
Ground, dried and ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but we do mordanting for days. Alum, tannin, tannin, alum. I think there's 4 mordant baths.
Vacuum helps to evaporate without any degradation to heat. We use at the beginning alcohol at 90 degrees and this one does percolate around 70. So we just redistillate again, we can recycle it. We just transfer the syrup, put it in the oven just to remove the water. This is how does a dry extract look like. We just cut it in small pieces and then grind it. We can use this for the analysis on spectrophotometry and then we can use it also for dye bath test.
I mean, there is often absolutely no point in preserving a hand-weaving tradition or something if nobody wants the product. But if you make something wonderful by a traditional process and you find a market for it, then it's going to survive. But I remember seeing people hand-weaving awful saris, you know, that nobody in their right minds would buy because they were, you know, they were expensive, they were uncomfortable, and they were ugly. No point in preserving something that isn't wanted. But I think people are doing a lot of good work in focusing on what will sell and really, you know, matching up the market and the weaver or the dyer or whatever. Whereas before, people would just sort of say, oh, support the weavers, and they'd make stuff.
In the world, what the demand in the market, that is necessary. If market available, we have, if order of the natural dye, then I make the natural dye. If we have no order for the natural dye, then we have coming some chemical customer, then I accept that. Because we need some job. But I hope future is good for the natural dye, and that is good for the world, environmental and health and everybody.
One farmer was growing it, and then two, and now they've got acres and acres of indigo. And the wonderful thing in El Salvador, which is extraordinary, there's a young woman in El Salvador who got interested in indigo and wanted to start reviving it, and investigated the best place and thought this land would be good, it's sort of fertile in the right sort of area. So off they went to this land that was wild, started hacking down the jungle, and they came across the old Spanish colonial tanks, and they'd actually chosen the same place again.
Future, my thing is all countries using natural dyeing and good feeling, and natural dye is also organic cotton, both using, so everybody is like this garment, bed cover, everything, home furnishing item, this one. And also more workers involved this one. My family, other 10 families coming. To natural dye, more workers involved.
But the future of natural dyes I feel very, very hopeful. In the past, natural dyes, there was a real possibility of them entirely disappearing, that the knowledge of growing the plants and the knowledge of dyeing and the knowledge of the recipes, that this was going to disappear. And I don't believe so now. I think both from the consumer's point of view and the production point of view and the artisans, there's a more, everything's connecting again. There's a buzz, there's a hum now that there is natural colorants out there, and it's not just to find them for our food, it is to find it for our clothing and every type of way that we use color.
My personal hope for the future is development of research, because I'm above all a scientific researcher. And also another hope is that development of natural dyes will change our color environment, because we all know that natural dyes are quite different from synthetic dyes. And the colors which result from natural dyes are really interesting, richer, more subtle, and they have a light in them which, if we manage to get more in the streets and more around ourselves, I think it will change in a way our vision of things, and I recognize, I feel something different in natural dyes.